CBS News and the New York Times released a survey last night which shows that many Americans are siding with labor unions in the current disputes. CBS News Director of Surveys Sarah Dutton joins me now to discuss this. Sarah, we see that 57%, 56% say that they oppose cutting pay or benefits. Does this surprise you? Is this a surprising finding?
Well, we specifically asked in the poll about public employees. We made that context very clear. This wasn't just about all union employees, but very specifically about those employed in the public sector. And that would include teachers, firefighters, police officers. That's certainly some of the images we've been seeing in news stories over the past 10 days from Wisconsin would make clear. So, it wasn't a complete surprise that 56% opposed cutting the pay and benefits for those kinds of employees. Only, as you said, only about 37% favor doing that.
And by a few more points, they oppose taking away collective bargaining rights.
That's right. 60% opposed taking away some collective bargaining rights from public employees. Only about a third favored that. Now, as you might expect, we saw some significant partisan differences on these two questions, with a majority of Republicans favoring both of those measures, and about 7 in 10 Democrats opposed to cutting pay and benefits for these employees or taking away some of their collective bargaining rights.
But then if you ask people what they are willing to do to reduce their state budget deficits, you get what I thought was kind of a surprising answer.
Well, it is a surprising answer. We presented them with a list of options, and 40% said that in order to close their state's budget deficit, they would be willing to increase taxes, and that is a surprise. We've been polling about the federal budget deficit for many months now, and it seems that Americans are much more likely to support cutting spending rather than raising taxes. But in this case, they preferred increasing taxes to decreasing benefits for public employees, decreasing the money spent on roads or transportation, or decreasing funding for education. Those were the choices we offered them in the question.
And this is despite a kind of split view on the power of unions, yes?
I think that we can't really make some general statements about unions overall based on these questions. As I said, these were very specific questions about a very specific set of employees. We did ask Americans in our poll, though, what they thought of labor unions overall. About a third had a favorable impression of unions. About a quarter had an unfavorable impression of them, and 4 in 10 had no opinion at all. But one of the interesting things we found is that it seems as though Americans' views of the influence of unions has declined. Back in 1981, that was 30 years ago, just after the air traffic controllers strike, we had about 60% of Americans tell us that labor unions at that time had too much influence in American politics and life in general. And that's dropped down to 37% now. So there is some evidence that Americans just don't see labor unions as influential as they once were.
Well, and in fact, in those years, labor union membership overall has declined significantly, although you don't touch on that in this poll.
We don't, but that would certainly be in keeping with what we did find in the poll.
Interesting question about motivation in this particular survey. What people believe the reason behind these efforts to cut the pay and benefits and bargaining power of unions is about. Tell us about that.
Right. That's where we saw opinion divided. We asked whether people thought that these efforts were motivated by a desire to reduce the state budget deficits, or whether it was motivated by a desire to weaken labor unions. And we found Americans were divided on this issue. 45% felt that this was a desire to reduce the state budget deficits, but about 41% felt that this was a desire to weaken labor unions. So there were some partisan differences on views between Republicans and Democrats, but overall divided.
And you talked earlier about how people are generally favorable, or tend to be favorable, to professions like police, fire, teachers. And again, you found in this survey that people think that a lot of them think that they should be able to retire early and collect their pensions.
Well, opinion was divided on that. We asked specifically whether police officers and firefighters should be allowed to retire after 25 years of service, regardless of their age. They could be in their 40s, they could be in their 50s. 49% said that they should be allowed to retire regardless of their age. Slightly fewer said that they should not. We also asked about teachers who can retire after a set number of years of service, even if they're under the age of 65. We had very similar result. About 49% said they should be able to retire. Slightly fewer said they should not. So some mixed views there. And, you know, I should point out that we haven't really tested in our poll differences in views between public employees or other union members. So I think that's something we look forward to doing in the future, and that may shed some more light on some of these questions.
Well, Sarah, given the fact that there is some division, and certainly partisan division, in the views of the public on this, and this issue has been so much in the news lately, are there any general conclusions you can draw?
Well, you know, it does seem to me that there's some sympathy for the public sector employees who are fighting the battles in some of these states. I think that we will need to see how this plays out with budget deficits and other cuts once they start being talked about more specifically. You know, people start feeling the pain of state budget cuts that may well influence their views on these issues. I think there's some real financial pressures in many of these states, and we'll see how those impact public opinion going forward.
All right, Sarah Dutton, CBS News Director of Surveys. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Bill.